It is a bizarre, bewildering, and chaotic world that we find ourselves in. Not just the younger generations and people slowly beginning to wake up to the course and trajectory of human civilization's underpinning systems and the very history and fabric of perceived reality that humanity has written for itself into this world. Our experience is a bewildering one, and rightfully so, because the human experience itself is kind of paralleled with contradiction and seeming opposite juxtaposed qualities in what exactly its endeavor and attempt in striving towards the things it brings into being through fabricating its advancements and technologies and various other creations and mediums and formalities, as well as how it sustains itself, seeming are always seemingly flying in the face and standing in the way of its own growth and development. Well, it's very obvious and plain to see as to why that is, given that humanity is always in the attempts to control and steer the course and trajectory of its entire species into a very specific, certain frame of influence and direction. Humanity basically is playing a Plinko machine with its own evolution. It is always attempting to steer and course correct its trajectory away from nature or away from what would be quintessentially harmonious to the species' actual evolution and development. All human endeavor is an attempt to basically remove humanity from its natural element and its nature and sequester it into a given adapted field of activity with portions of nature spliced in it to guarantee its survival. We have to ask truly what brings us into such a ponderous existence as this species that we find ourselves embodying. Beyond that, and to begin, I think it's first of all necessary to correct an allegory that has existed in the modern era that has overtaken and overswept our minds with a given perception of life being devoid of any true intrinsic meaning and purpose, and that is to tackle the issue of nihilism. Now, I am somebody who's struggled with depression and suicidal ideation in their lifetime, and I can tell you, nihilism being what it is and studying this beast, this void, from my own experience, is kind of a interesting, intrinsically complex and simple issue in itself, because in a lot of senses it is as though we are staring into the very abyss of being itself. However, nihilism itself, more well strategically put, through observation and words, when seen for what it is more or less the projection of the mind's ideas onto a given notion of reality rather than the true essence of reality itself. In its way, nihilism is one of the most destructive illusions and machinations of the human mind that we can fall into. It is a very misunderstood observation of what reality intrinsically is. And it's kind of from an absurdist lens that I come from this, so don't expect a viewpoint grounded in philosophies and sciences that I give you, because it takes absurdity to escape the grip of the mind's labyrinth, which builds and confounds us into the paralyzing nature of nihilism in the first place. You see, when the human body reaches a capacity in which it overextends and hyperextends its ability to handle its material environment, and when the mind is accelerated to a point of essentially attempting to ping its sonar on the world out external and outside of us, we can become stuck in very excessively hyper accelerated loops and trains of thinking that we don't often realize are fundamentally wearing down our own capacity for experiences and interaction with the environment. We are so overstimulated these days that the mind kind of falls out of a nascent state of using its own faculties to try and weigh and measure and balance its observations of a world that is essentially lost in the sauce of its own history, that we fall into defense mechanisms and kind of reactive animalistic responses through the human body that drain our energy trying to keep the brain's capacity, which we are reliant and dependent on out of conditioning and social behaviors of the modern era to follow. We are dependent on the mind and the brain to be functioning at a hyper accelerated capacity and activity constantly, and this wears us out and wears us down. What we fall into is a state and stage of depression, which is unfortunately in the West not recognized for its actual nature. Depression is the result of basically overwhelming and flooding the system with too much activity, and it's kind of like a chrysalis state in which rest and recovery should be prioritized. However, because we live in the world that we do, that pushes us to perform to our highest capacity constantly, and because we, being a species that is always pushing its own boundaries further and further, we can exacerbate the problems of that. One thing that happens is that the mind, falling into that state of just numbness and that need for rest, can attempt to read and place and put a idea and an objective reality over a perspective that it's not actually capable of understanding, because the mind is just producing thoughts, and it is attempting to put into shape, into texture, into substance, a formality that cannot be really described authentically or put into a word or machination. The meditative state and the state of depression are kind of one and the same symbiotic thing. It is a state kind of similar to when the caterpillar enters the chrysalis. It is a transformative state. It is a rejuvenating state that shifts the polarities and the balance of the organism, and it requires rest and introspection. And one thing that the mind cannot do in the modern day and age is really understand that it has the capacity to stop functioning and not be dependent on the system of thought itself to continuously project a layer and a template of understanding onto reality, which is what we live in and which is what we've been taught to do. The reason nihilism exists so abundantly is because that same mechanism and template of attempting to assign values to reality is now being, or attempting to be, assigned to the intrinsic mystery of consciousness itself, the introspective state of just being, of resting, of abiding in awareness. The mind is not capable really of fathoming the depth and the level at which consciousness dwells, because consciousness is not really attached to anything. It's actually the absence of any intrinsic structure. It's, in a way, the space in which thoughts float through, and thought cannot grasp or perceive or understand this, so our minds continue to race until they accelerate to such a degree that they wear themselves down wholly and totally. And what stems of that, when there is still an attachment to thoughts, is an intrinsic belief in notion that life quintessentially itself is without meaning or without purpose. And that's the kicker of this, is that that in itself is just an idea. No different than all the other ideas that people subscribe meaning and purpose to. Nihilism itself is an idea. It's just another state of mind. So that should tell you how unfathomably deep at the level of capacity for the human brain is. It can get lost in its own labyrinth. Now, I've experienced and gone through my own portions of nihilism in my lifetime, and I've overcome them kind of with a very easy observation that I wish to share. And luckily, this part of the video is a lot shorter than the explanation of nihilism itself. To perceive life as meaningless and utterly hopeless is to fall short of really seeing and understanding the value in your own being and your own existence. Life and meaning intrinsically don't subscribe a value metric or a value system to what society and civilization consider normal. Meaning and purpose are not intrinsically produced by a metric of success, which is what humans weigh and measure everything to be about. It's a materialistic viewpoint that has really hypnotized us into believing that life is meaningless